Good morning. My name is Richard Wexler, and once again, we would like to invite you to episode 9 of our podcast entitled Elder Ed Education, Solutions, and Resources to Navigate Aging and Care. So, a little recap like we do on every episode. About 18 years ago, my wife, myself, our two small children began caring for all four of our parents. That turned into a 14-year unbelievable journey, which then created our company, Points of Life, allowed us to provide education, solutions, and resources for thousands across the country. We started the podcast to reach even more. So today we're going to welcome Barbara McVicker. First, I want to give you a little background on her, and then I'm going to bring her on the broadcast. So Barbara was a caregiver to her parents for 10 years, and she did that while raising two children and struggling to maintain her career. She became an elder care expert, a national speaker, and an author. She has written Stuck in the Middle, shared stories and tips on caring for mom and dad. She has also written Before Things Fall Apart, preparing to care for mom and dad, and Before Things Fall Apart, the Essential Workbook. She works with healthcare professionals, caregivers, financial institutions, human resources departments to create a work-life balance, and attorneys. And Barbara has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, USA Today, CNN, NBC, and more. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you very much. It's good to reconnect with you.
I totally agree. So I'm kind of looking forward to this conversation. One of the things you may be aware of, and we've talked offline about this, and in a lot of my previous episodes, I keep talking about planning. And we're going to get to that in a few minutes and why that's so important. And I know some people may listen to this, oh, it's not that big in my life. We'll just take care of it when it happens. And I think you and I are in agreement that probably is not the best way to go. But before we do that, what I'd like to start with, I find it interesting, like my own story. Most people that get involved in the elder care, the elder care industry, it's because of personal experience. Could you share with our audience what led you to get involved and what your story is?
Yes, first I want to say when PBS approached me to do a special on caregiving, that kind of meant that they were realizing across the country that a lot of people were in this mess. And that's when I did the special for them. And a lot of my story and my products and stuff are at barbaramcvicker.com because we only have a short bit of time here. And both Richard and I realize this is a big problem where there's lots of steps to it and you need to get organized sooner than later. In my case, I was doing a high level job. I got the phone call from my dad's bank that he sent $68,000 in cashier's checks to Canada because he'd won the Canadian lottery. So I happen to be caught in a scam, which is becoming more and more prevalent. But it could be a phone call from an ER that your dad is in the hospital. It almost always happens in a crisis, and nobody does well in a crisis, particularly when you have all those other family members being a part of this. And if you don't already organize, families can disintegrate. So Richard is right. Start now.
Yeah, it's so important, and as I've talked about in previous episodes, and I'm sure that people are almost tired of me talking about it, but this whole plan word, I talk about the fact that's to some a dirty four-letter word, but we've talked about this. It's like the adult children graduate in life. They start young, they become adults. At some point, they may get married, they have children. During this time, their loved ones, whether it's parents, whether it's grandparents, whether it's in laws, they do what happens. They age. And then, we would love, well, let me rephrase that. I'm not sure if people would love to live to 100, 105, 110, 120, like some people are, but we are living a lot longer. And as adult children go through their life, I know in my case, you're not really thinking about these loved ones in your life that are aging. And what Barbara talks about, and I talk about, and we're about to talk about jointly, is that okay? You're having a great life. You're enjoying your children start getting older. They potentially go off to college or go off to their own life. So you have graduated from that phase in your life. And now you're going to travel and you're going to do all these things that you didn't do maybe when your children or younger are younger, or things start happening like in my life, Barbara's life, even when your kids are young, things start happening to these older loved ones. And I'm being facetious when I asked you this question, Barbara, but there's obviously a class called Caregiving 101A that everybody takes in college, right?
Yes, you are facetious. The rule of thumb, kind of in our industry, is that when you are 40 and your parents are 70, that's when you should have the conversation, go to the financial advisor, go to the attorney, make certain the whole family knows what one's wishes are for how to age, where to age, who's in charge, and to disseminate all the chores among all the adult children. My biggest selling point on getting people moving is once you've been a caregiver to your parents, you don't want to do this to your kids. You really do want to make your own decisions. You really do want to get organized. But darn it, we're still waiting for that crisis, aren't we, Richard?
Yeah, and I know you've spoken to so many people, and I've had the privilege of doing that as well. And some people, what I'm talking about, and I'm sure what you're talking about, it resonates right away. And having that conversation, like you say, the 40-70 rule. But then a lot of people look at me like, I don't want to have that conversation. This is difficult stuff. We're talking about getting sick and we're talking about dying. But I know in your book you talk about 8 steps to prepare to care for mom and dad. And if I recall, the first step that you talk about is kind of along the lines of what we're discussing right now, educating yourself about caregiving. Can you speak about that?
Yeah. Like you said, we kind of put our heads in the sand. Both the adult children, they think, oh, maybe I don't have to do this now. Mom doesn't need me now. Or mom doesn't want to talk about it. And that's the other flip side is sometimes the aging parent doesn't want to talk about it. But by doing that, you're getting yourself into such a mess because sooner or later, those people are going to age and they're going to need help in many ways. Help not only daily activities, maybe helping them move to a continuing care retirement community, but the rule right now is that for the adult child, about 10% of their income goes to taking care of mom and dad. And I think most of us have never, and even financial planners who I work with a lot, you're doing a disservice to your customers if you're not saying you are in this full tilt. You're in this emotionally, physically, financially, and everything else to help your parents. But you can't make good decisions if you're waiting for a crisis.
So, if I'm getting what you're saying, part of this education is everything you just talked about. Really, if you're not working with a financial planner, I get that, but you need to find someone like a Barbara, like me, like other people around the country who can really educate you about probably one of the biggest issues, which is cost. And so, what's going to happen as something happens to mom or something happens to dad, or maybe a grandparent who could be older, 85, 90 plus? What is that going to cost? It's a huge issue. So, there's a lot of pieces, and we're going to probably talk in later episodes and even more depth with Barbara about each one of these steps. But there's a lot of issues that you need to get educated about. If I could actually go to schools, to colleges, and say, you need to be teaching Elder Care 101A, first 101A, first of all, they'd laugh at me, but it's true. And it's a part of our life that we need to really get educated about. I know the second step that you talk about is assessing your parents' situation or your in-laws or your grandparents. What do you mean there?
I think that as people age, things just kind of slip off of the table, slip off of the plate, little at a time. And if you're in it, you don't see those changes. Also, maybe your whole family isn't around to see those changes. So, to make certain that you're being very aware of how mom and dad are doing, I have 8 different categories to look at in their lives. And if I had had that when I was taking care of my parents, I would have noticed what was going on. Like one of the categories that I have there is the financial. It is not criminal for you to pull open the desk drawer and look at your parents' mail or look at their checkbook. If I had done that, I would have seen that my dad was doing all these crazy things. And that's happening more and more with scams where people are sending money, they're going to the bank. Go to the bank and say, put my name on with their account so that if something crazy goes on, you have the right to call me. The same thing with financial advisors. Um, so, so get ready ahead of time. Look at every aspect of their life, everything from cleanliness to can they actually make appointments for the doctor? More than that is, can they keep them? What's the food look like? Are they really taking care of themselves, both mentally and physically? And the big new thing that everybody's talking about as a new chronic illness is loneliness, isolation. How much interaction are they having with other people? Is it time for you to actually take them out? Is it time for them to move to some other situation where not only are their food taken care of and all their other things, but more than that is they've got community with other people. They've got activities, things to keep them up and mobile. I made certain that when my parents turned into, I actually put them in a CCRC because it was the best choice. I made certain that their apartment was as far away from the cafeteria as it could be because they would do anything to go get that food or that cup of coffee.
And that's wonderful advice. And I know the third step, and it seems like this third step is so important almost before we do this assessment that you've been talking about. And that's learning how to talk to mom and dad. When I'm out speaking or online speaking, I get questions all the time. We like that, but how do we have that conversation? My dad's not going to listen to me. I mean, part of it, I think the generation of adult children that are over 60 have something a little bit different going on than the ones that are a little bit younger. that generation with parents that came out of the Depression and World War II, there was almost this wall set up that the parent never gave any information to the children. You would never tell your adult, what are now your adult children, the children back there, what you made or what the mortgage was on the house. And I think what you're talking about, and if we can kind of correlate this into having this conversation, that wall has to be broken down and you need all that data. But backing up a little bit, do you have any advice on how people start and have this conversation with parents, in-laws, etc.?
I think the overall question is, mom and dad, we want to make certain that as you age, you are doing it the way you want to do it. But we need to know what that is. We need to have the conversations about um, not only end of life and maybe the question of hospice and all the other things that go into actually end of life, but as you're aging, how do you picture that? How do you want that done? And how can we make certain that you're doing it the way you want to, but we're also part of this out of love and safety, we're being included. For instance, you can say, I'm going to my attorney and I wonder if you would come too and just have him look at your things to make certain that everything kind of works together. I've had I've had people come up in an audience after I've spoken and said, as I've said, and tell them, pull out your trusts, etc. And we don't actually usually do that. We are kind of afraid to say, actually pull it out and let's go together. We just say, hey, do you have a will? Hey, do you have a trust? And I've had people in audiences come up and say, yeah, I agree with you. That isn't sufficient. When my dad died, they opened the trusts and nothing had been titled into them. So, as Richard said, a lot of these bits and pieces are very complicated and time consuming. You have to help your parent do all those things like titling things into a trust, actually maybe even going to attorney. Maybe they don't even have a will. But the thing is, the other part of that you might say to your parent is, do you want the government or some other entity deciding how your possessions, how your money is going to be dealt with? Instead, let's go get it so that you're in charge of all that. You are making the decisions. You're seeing how things are going to be dispersed.
Excellent advice. The big legal word is intestate, and you don't want your parents dying intestate. I mean, I've never thought about what I'm about to say, but this conversation is taking me there. You, as the adult child, almost become the director of this movie that may be the last 20, 30, 40 years of mom and dad's life, and you're trying to not tell them what to do because they're probably not going to listen, but to help direct them to all the things that Barbara's talking about. And I know in one of your next steps, and this is complicated for a lot of families, and that's really trying to have productive family meetings. You may have adult brothers and sisters all over the country, all over the world, and you're trying to get on the same wavelength, the same plan to be able to direct mom and dad. What are your thoughts about that, Barbara?
I'm glad you brought that up because that is one of the most vital points is that everybody should share in the care. If any sibling isn't sharing in that care by either giving someone respite or saying, I'll be the Medicare expert or I'll pay all the bills, um, that's not fair. And in fact, when it isn't fair, once the person passes, the family don't talk anymore. You weren't there. You weren't helping me. I spent the whole end of my life taking care of mom and dad, and where were you? So there can be a lot of sibling rivalry going on at that point, and a family meeting becomes even more important when you're really actually doing a lot of care to set up who's going to do this week? Who's going to do that week? Who's going to phone mom every Sunday to see how she's talking and what's going on? So take tasks, break them down, have people sign up for them. Run a meeting just like you would at work. We're going to start at 9 o'clock. Everybody phone in or Zoom in, whatever. And we're going to talk about how to best do this and how to stick together as a family and do the best for mom and dad.
That's wonderful advice, especially when there's multiple brothers and sisters, the adult children in the family. Well, I'm really busy and I can't do that. Well, maybe the person that's really busy has a gift for finances that can help once the conversation has taken place with mom and dad, help manage money online, things we can do now that we couldn't do 20, 30, 40 years ago. So there probably is a place for most of the siblings because what Barbara talks about, and I've talked about this on previous episodes, there can be really hurt feelings in a family, especially like in my situation or Barbara's, where care takes many, many years. And I've actually seen, which I've talked about, is lawsuits. You don't want that. And I know that most mom and dads are, because they said it to me, we want you and your siblings getting along when we pass. So that's extremely important. You talk about decluttering mom and dad's home. And before I ask you about that, we hear so often, let's say the conversation takes place and the response from mom or dad or both, we're staying here, we're staying in the house, which may be the right or wrong thing. But what happens when there's so much stuff within the house and maybe walking mobility is now an issue for mom, dad, or potentially even both of them?
Yeah, I know aging in place has become a hot topic, but as Richard said, there's many aspects to looking whether that is the right thing for your parents. For my parents, it wasn't because, first of all, they weren't. Aging at the same rate. So a CCRC, continuing care retirement community, worked well for them because one of them would get ill, flip into the nursing home, get better, come back into independent living. One of them would break a leg, come back, join the other one back in independent living. So it was a really good choice. The other thing was that by making a move at some point, instead of just staying in the home in which the kids grew up in, makes one downsize, declutter just to move to some other situation. So for us, that was the trauma. The trauma was that taking all that stuff, and all that stuff's really important, and trying to downsize to the point of moving into independent living. And I'm glad that didn't happen on top of a death. That would have been devastating. But the thing I did was take boxes and label them, the grandkids' names, the children's names, Goodwill, the church, whatever. And it took over a month. And I'm certain Richards had gone through the same thing of going every day and saying, we're going to just for an hour do this, and then we're going to do something fun, but we're going to go through this. The funny thing is that you can show up the next day and they've taken things out of the boxes.
I can second that. I mean, you think about, and this happens to a lot of families. Mom, dad are still in the family home. They've been in for 50 plus years. And think of all, I use this word a lot. Think of all the stuff that they've acquired in 50 plus years. And if mobility, if maybe cognition, if different things are now an issue, which used to be, they could make their balletic moves and get around the stuff in the house. They can't do that anymore. And they may potentially fall, which leads me into your next issue. And it's the issue of researching the options that are out there for housing. Like I say, most families I've met, maybe Barbara's met, have talked with, they want to stay home. And I'm maybe as I get even older, I'm going to want to do that. I get that. This is your home. But sometimes it doesn't make sense. And sometimes you're leaving the home to through hospitalization, then off to skilled nursing. But we've talked about on previous episodes about some beautiful assisted livings. If you're old enough and you remember this, some of them look like the Love Boat. They're very nice. There are memory communities where someone goes that probably has memory issues, as Barbara was talking about, and I'll ask her to talk about this again. The CCRC, which is a location, it's kind of like a campus sometimes. And there's actually the skilled nursing facility there, independent living, assisted living, so mom or dad can possibly be moved around per the need that they have. But before I open it back up to Barbara, what's involved with all of this? Money. And as we've talked about, it's not cheap. But what advice would you give families to start looking into researching their housing options, Barbara?
Well, first of all, um, many people do end up staying in their homes. And we're very fortunate that in the years since I took care of my parents, been a plethora now of different kinds of in home care. And people that come in and retrofit the house, take away the throw rugs and put in a no line shower and grab bars. So there's all kinds of things that can help keep someone living in their own space. One of the things, though, that people kind of talk about is if you're spending $40,000 a year to keep mom and dad in their house, you might have a better use of that money to have another option and to look at those other options. It's overwhelming to just take mom and dad to 50 places. You need to go look and see what it is. But then you need to actually take mom and dad and tell them that, the people we're going to have a free lunch and we're going to look at this facility. You've got to get them out there early to see, maybe not make a choice, but to see what's out there because in their mind, it's what grandma went to and they can't get that vision out. And maybe you can't either. So go out, research, narrow things down. Do you want, do they need green space? Do they need a putt putt golf course? Do they need to be close to you? All kinds of things that might make you narrow down even what you want to go look at. Then go look at a couple of them. Then I think what you might want to do is if you have one that you think is really great, pick one that's really horrible and take them to those two so that they'll make the choice you want them to make. But do it when everybody can make decisions and when they can be part of the decision making. Are you going to move this month or after Christmas? You want this place to go to or that place. They've got to make some choices just like you would with a 2-year old. You can't just say, we're going to go. In my case, I was fortunate. Take advantage of every crisis that comes up. It's a good chance to get rid of the car. It's a good chance to make a move. It's a good chance to make them go to the attorney. If something happens, use that as a template to make them decide that it's time to make some decisions.
Wow, that's excellent advice. And one thing I think we've talked about in previous episodes, and I'm going to bring it up again, to really help the adult children find that location for mom, dad to move to a beautiful assisted living. All around the country, there are senior specialists, placement specialists that will work with the family. And the way most of them are compensated, and a lot of people don't realize this, the family doesn't pay them any money. Once mom moves in or dad to a beautiful community, that community will pay that placement agent, but they obviously know all the communities, all the memory care communities in their location. we're starting to put together an elder care guide, which will be online. Folks like that will be listed. We're just starting with that. In the interim, you can find them by probably Googling something along the lines of senior placement specialist, and they will most likely pop up in your locale and can be extremely helpful. As we kind of get near the end of this conversation today, one of the things as we bring Barbara back in the future, we're going to talk about all these 8 steps in more detail. We're also going to talk about something else that may be a subject in and of itself. And I know Barbara's written about this. I talk about it a lot. Is just the effect of aging and care on our society. What is that going to do to the United States that we've known growing up? And what's going to happen when family members are being pulled and asked to take care of mom, dad, etc.? Do you have some thoughts on that, Barbara?
Yes, in fact, I was working with China some years ago. They contacted me and another expert. They, of course, had the one child only, and many of them actually killed females so they would have the male. Well, you can imagine what happened when two parents have a male and he's gone off to some other big city to work. They had no government, no national support system for those elderly that now were left completely alone back on the farm, way out in the country. And they instituted a horrible law where you have to visit your mom and dad twice a year as a law to be able to, I guess, maybe say to themselves, oh, we're doing our job. But it can be a huge mess. So we don't have enough caregivers. We don't pay them well enough. The government each year, I think this is the year that caregiving and elder care is going to raise to the top of the national discussion. And as you know, there's always something hotter on top of that. So they kind of go around the edges, but not enough. We do not have enough low income housing for people. We don't have enough, even though we've got a lot of good support systems compared to other places in the world. They're still not good enough, and we need to support the adult children. We need to support mom and dad, but we also need to support those other people that can do hands-on work.
Wow. I mean, and again, we will be talking about these 8 steps in more detail in future episodes. We'll be talking about this broader effect on society, effect on the world. We've never been here before. We've talked about, and I've used the numbers in about 20, 25 years in the United States, there's going to be pushing 160 million people that are 50 and older. Folks, we've never been there. And if we don't start thinking about this, it's going to be on top of us. And as Barbara was talking about, where are all the caregivers? How are they getting compensated? Where are the adult children? Can we ask them to leave their lives, their jobs, and take care of mom and dad? And they love mom and mom and dad raised them. But what's real? And how are we going to manage all this as that many people age? And as I've talked about on previous episodes, and the number I use, about 95% of us are going to need some form of care. Maybe for some people, that's a minimal amount, but that's going to affect most families. So, this subject of the effect on society is going to be huge. So I really want to thank Barbara. She's given some fantastic information, some fantastic tips. As I said, we're going to have her back and talk about a lot more of these in detail. I mean, folks, you know the goal of this podcast. We want to provide the education. We want to provide the solutions. We're building this resource guide to provide just that, the resources. We're trying to make this, I tell people, this point in their life will never be easy, but through help and guidance, if we can make it easier, then possibly we've succeeded. As I've talked about on other episodes, I want to leave you folks with an email. Send me comments, send me questions. We will respond to those comments and questions. Do you have a pen? The email again is eldered2023 at gmail.com. ELDERED2023 at gmail.com. So, Barbara, I thank you, and we will be talking again in the future.
I would like to add something,
Sure.
Richard, that on my website, there's lots of free information that are topics that we didn't have a chance to discuss today. But if you're really wanting to educate yourself, drop in at my website, barbaramcvicker.com, and the YouTubes, the PBS special, all kinds of things are just sitting there to give you either a push to start to get organized or how to get organized. Thank you.
Perfect. And actually, I was a naughty boy for not allowing you to give the website. Do you want to give a phone number or anything else?
I think the website is the best place, and then all my other information's there too.
Perfect. That is fantastic. So, folks, as I always say when I sign off, please have an awesome day, and we will be talking the next time.